They exiled him at 13 for lying about the coming blizzard. Gunnar Strand, who had survived 7 Dakota winters, told him plainly, "When you fail, the children of this valley freeze with you." He had no money, no family, and needed 8 cords of firewood he could not cut alone. On February 2nd, 1881, the sky turned white in 10 minutes. But 5 months earlier, Halvor Eriksson had never built anything larger than a rabbit's snare in his life. The James River Valley in the summer of 1880 did not look like a place that could kill you. The grass ran flat and gold to the horizon. The sky was enormous and blue from a distance. The 11 saw cabins scattered across the valley floor looked almost settled, almost permanent, like something that would last. They would not last. Halvor Eriksson knew this stretch of land better than almost anyone. His father, Niels, had filed one of the first claims here in the spring of '79. Halvor had watched him measure the quarter section with a chain, stamp the corner stakes, and say a prayer Norwegian with his hat pressed to his chest. He had watched him dig the first courses of sod from the earth and stack them like bricks into walls 2 feet thick. And he had watched him bury that same father in that same earth. 14 months later, in June of 1880, when the typhoid came through and took him in 9 days, Halvor was 13. He was the only one left. His mother, Rani, had died 2 years before that. Cholera on the steamboat up the Missouri before they ever reached Dakota territory. Niels had kept going anyway, north and west toward the promise of free land, pulling a boy in a trunk and not much else. Now the boy had the land. He had the claim. He had his sod house 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep, a woodshed 38 feet to the west, and a half-broke ox named Pear that he had no idea how to winter. He also had no money to speak of, no neighbors who would help him, and approximately 8 weeks before the first snow, Gunnar Strand was the first to tell him what that meant. Strand was 51 years old, broad-shouldered, with a beard that had gone white at the jaw. He had arrived in Dakota territory in '73 and survived every winter since, including the Easter blizzard that year that raged for 80 hours without stopping, and killed every living thing that was caught outside. 7 winters he had buried 2 oxmen in that '73 storm, dug himself out of a drift by field in the dark, and walked for miles on frozen feet to reach the settlement's only other family. When Gunnar Strand told you something about winter, you listened. He came to Halvor's claim on a Tuesday in late August, ostensibly to check on the boy. He looked at the woodshed. He looked at the half-stacked pile of cottonwood rounds by the splitting block. He looked at Halvor. "How much have you cut?" Strand said, 34 of a cord. Halvor said, "Maybe a bit more." Strand said nothing for a moment. "Then you need 5 cords to survive a normal winter, 7 to be safe. You have 6. Weeks before the first hard freeze, he paused. A grown man with a cross saw cuts half a cord a day on good timber. You are not a grown man. You do not have good timber. The cottonwood along the James burns fast and dirty. You will need more of it." Halvor said he understood that. He was working on it. "No," Strand said, "you don't understand. A boy alone cannot cut 7 cords of cottonwood in 6 weeks and also maintain a claim, and also tend an ox and also cook and sleep. The arithmetic does not work in your favor." He looked at the woodshed again. "Your father was a good man. I will speak to the claim club about finding you a place for the winter. A household that needs a worker, an apprenticeship." Strand was offering him a way to survive by giving up everything his father had built. Halvor thanked him and said no. Strand left. He did not look back. 3 days later, in the cooling evenings of late August, Halvor walked down to the lake half a mile east of his claim. He went to check the muskrat houses in the Catals. His father had shown him how to read them. Niels had grown up in northern Norway where men watch animals the way sailors watched clouds. Looking for what was coming, what Halvor saw stopped him on the bank. The muskrat houses were enormous. Normally they rose 18 in above the water line. Rounded domes of mud and seatail stems, these were nearly 3 feet tall. The walls were thick enough that he could press his whole fist against the side and feel no give. He walked the bank and found 4 more houses. all of them the same, built heavy and high as if the animals knew they would need the protection. He stood there for a long time. He had read about this in the Kane book, Arctic Explorations. The account of Elisha Kent Kane's voyage toward the North Pole in 1853. His father had bought it from a peddler for 25 cents and read it aloud on winter evenings with a candle between them. The book described Inuit villages and Inuit weather knowledge, and Kane wrote that the Inuit paid close attention to animal behavior in late summer. Thick walls on the muskrat houses meant the animals expected a long and buried winter. The geese confirmed it. They had left the valley 3 weeks earlier than any autumn Halvor could remember. And then there was the Lakota woman, the one who came to Fox Trading Post every few weeks to exchange hides and dried berries. Halvor had heard her talking to Fox in late July, speaking slowly in the few English words she knew, pointing north, holding up 7 fingers. 7 moons. The winter would last 7 moons. Folk had laughed, Halvor had not. He walked home in the dark and sat at the table where his father used to read, and thought about what 7 moons of winter meant, October through April, snow on the ground from first freeze to last thaw, and not ordinary snow, the kind of snow that filled the coulees, the kind that drifted over fences and covered roofs and packed against doors, until no man alive could push them open. He thought about what happened if the door was buried. You could not reach your woodshed. You could not reach your neighbors. You could not reach anyone. You sat inside until the fuel ran out and the coal came in, and then you died. He was a boy, alone. No one would dig him out. He thought about that for a long time. Then he opened the Kane book and began to read. The Claim Club meeting was held on the 15th of September in Strand's cabin. 11 homesteaders crowded around the table and along the walls, hats in hand, talking about winter preparations. Strand went through the list. The 5 cords minimum, 7 preferred rope to the barn and woodshed before the first storm, banking. Saw it against the exterior walls for insulation. The usual. Everyone nodded. Halvor waited until they had finished. Then he stood up. He was the youngest person in the room by 15 years. He was also, he understood, the person with the least right to speak. He spoke anyway. He told them about the muskrat houses. He told them about the geese. He told them about the Lakota woman's 7 fingers. He watched their faces while he talked. Most of them were patient. A few were not. Then he told them what he thought they needed to do differently, not just more wood. A different way to reach the wood. He described it in pieces. First, a hatch cut through each cabin roof, framed in lumber, hinged with leather, sealed against wind, an exit that no amount of snow could block because the snow could only pile on top of it, and a man could push up through snow. Second, a covered wooden framework built between cabin and woodshed before the snows came. 13 frames of cottonwood posts and cross beams roofed with planks, creating a passage 5 trillion tall and 3 feet wide. When the snow buried it, the wood would hold the shape, and the passage would stay clear. Third, stockpile not 5 cords, not 7. 15. He had read about something like the tunnel in Kane's book. The Inuit built connected snow houses with underground passages between them. Cold air settled in the low entry tunnel and could not reach the living space above. The snow itself became the insulating wall. He was proposing the same principle, with wood instead of ice, built before the snow arrived instead of after. The room was quiet. Thomas Ring spoke first. He was 38, precise, German-American, the man who had built the settlement's only frame house and done it with squared timbers and a level. He was not unkind. 40 feet of tunnel, Ring said, 5 feet tall, 3.5 feet wide. That's 700 cubic feet of enclosed space to build frame and roof. He thought about it. A grown man with a good crew might manage that in a week. Who builds it for you? I do, Halvor said. Ring shook his head, not meanly. A boy cutting a quarter cord a day needs 60 days to stack 15 cords. You have less than 40 days before freeze. The tunnel takes 12 days if you work without stopping. You cannot do both. The arithmetic does not allow it. I can do both, Halvor said. You cannot. Strand's voice cut through the room. Everyone went quiet. He had let Halvor speak. He had been patient. He was finished being patient. I buried 2 oxen in the 73 storm. Strand said, I have seen snow to my chest. I have never, not once, seen snow bury a door that a man with his shovel could not clear by morning. The boy reads too many books and not enough sky. He looked at the room, not at Haver. We prepare as we always have. 5 cords minimum, rope to the barn. Seal the windows. That is how we live through winter in Dakota Territory. Not by cutting holes in our roofs like fools. Elias Falk laughed from the back of the room. Bach was 44, Anglo-American, the settlement's only trader and the man who controlled credit for most of the families in the valley. He had not laughed at the muskrat story. He had laughed at the tunnel. The boy is touched, Fox said. First, it was the muskrats, then the Indian woman's prophecy. Now he wants us to cut holes in our roofs based on a picture book about Eskimos. He paused. I say we stop indulging this. The boy needs a master, not a claim. Send him to apprentice and Huron before he freezes to death on his father's dirt. The room murmured, not in agreement. Not entirely, but in the way rooms murmur when someone has said what everyone was privately thinking. Strand called for a decision. The claim club voted. Oliver could keep his father's claim, but no communal resources would support his project. No shared lumber, no shared tools, no labor. If he wanted to cut holes in his own roof, that was his business. The settlement would prepare as it always had. Haver walked home alone in the September dark. He was 13 years old. He had 40 days. He had an axe, a handsaw, a flat spade, a broken wagon, and a water-damaged book about the Arctic. He began the next morning. The roof hatch came first. He chose the peak of the saw roof between 2 plans, where the structure was most solid, and the sod lay thinnest. He marked a rectangle in chalk 30 in wide, 36 in long, then he cut. Sod comes up in bricks if you cut it right, straight down with a flat spade. Then pry from the side. He had watched his father do this when they built the walls. He did it now on the roof, kneeling on the slope, working brick by brick until the hole opened beneath him. He could see into his own cabin, the stove, the table, the cane book on the shelf. He framed the opening with 4 pieces of lumber from the broken wagon bed, notching them to sit against the plant, hammering them with the iron mallet. Then, the doors, 3 planks battened with cross pieces, roughly 25 pounds. He cut the strips from an old harness and nailed them on as hinges. He threaded a length of hemp rope through a hole bored in the center of the door, knotted it on top, fixed a wooden handle to the underside. From inside he could pull the handle and the door would rise. He sealed the frame with a strip of old wool blanket and rubbed tallow into every joint. Then he climbed the ladder, pushed the door open from below and pulled himself through and onto the roof. He stood in the September air and looked at the settlement. 11 cabins, 11 woodsheds, 11 chimneys, all of them looking like they always had. 2 days of work. The hatch was done. He gave himself 20 minutes to rest. Then he went to the James River. He needed wood, not for burning, not yet, but for the tunnel frames. Cottonwood grew thick in the river bends for miles east. And what the river offered was free. He spent 3 days making runs with a hand-pulled sleigh, hauling poles 6 feet long and 4 in across, stacking them beside the cabin until he had 26, for miles there, for miles back. Twice a day when he could manage it, the sled loaded with 6 or 8 poles, the rope cutting into his shoulders on the return. He arrived home after dark, ate cornmeal mush and slept without dreaming. On the 4th day, he began splitting. Each pole became 2 posts. He notched the tops to accept a crossbeam. He cut the cross beams from salvaged wagon sideboards 3.5 foot across, rough saw, solid, enough to hold the weight of packed snow. He assembled the first frame in the yard and stood it upright between his hands to test it. It held 13 frames total, one every 3 feet from the cabin's west wall to the woodshed door, 38 feet across. He set the first frame on September 22nd, digging. The post holes was the worst part. The soil was hard clay with a thin topsoil over it, and the flat spade rang against it with every blow. He drove each post 2 feet into the ground, tamped it with a rock, braced it with a diagonal strut. Then he set the cross beam. Then he laid planks across the cross beams, rough boards, wagon sideboards, anything flat to form the roof of the passage. He worked 14 hours a day. He woke before light and quit when he could not see. By the end of the first week of frames, he had 6 standing. The passage ran 20 feet from the cabin wall, 19 feet more to the woodshed. His shoulders had gone from aching to something past aching, a deep burn he no longer noticed unless he stopped moving. He did not stop moving. On the 8th day, Reliant came by. He stood at the edge of the property and watched Haver set at the 7th frame. He watched for a while without speaking. How many total? Ring asked finally. 13, Alvar said. Done in for more days if the weather holds. Reliant looked at the passage. The 6 completed frames, the rough plank roof, the open sides where snow would eventually pack and hold. He was a man who understood construction. He measured things with his eyes the way other men measured with tools. The frames will hold under snow weight, he said, assuming you pack the outside tight with brush before the storms come. If you leave it open on the sides, the first wind will drive drift straight through. Alvar had already thought of this. He told Ringling about the brush he had planned to weave willow branches into the spaces between frames, creating a semi-solid wall that snow would accumulate against rather than through. Rain looked at him for a moment. Where did you read that, Kane? Halvar said. Inu build connected snow houses. They pack the outside of the walls so the snow builds up around them, not through them. I just built the inside support in wood first. Ringling said nothing. He studied the frames a moment longer, then he walked away without another word. 3 days later, a bundle appeared at the end of Haver's property line, a roll of woven willow fencing, the kind used for windbreaks, approximately 40 feet long. There was no note, no name. Haver used it to side the tunnel frames that same afternoon. He did not go to thank Ring. He understood the arrangement. Ring had not helped him. He had simply discarded some old material he no longer needed. That was the story they would both tell if anyone asked. The frames were finished on October 8th. Halvar walked the length of the passage from the cabin wall to the woodshed door. 5 feet of clearance inside, 3.5 feet wide. The plank roof did not flex under his hands. The willow sides held their shape. The entry at the cabin end had a rough wooden door, salvaged planks, leather hinges that swung inward. He stood inside the passage and thought about February. He had 6 days before Ringling's deadline became real. He still had 5.5 cords of wood to cut. He went to the woodshed and counted what he had. 3.25 cords of split cotton, wood, and elm stacked tight from floor to rafter on the north wall. He needed 8 cords to get the settlement through a bad stretch, more if the winter went as long as the Lakota woman said. He could not cut 8 cords in 6 days. He could not. He cut 2.33 cords in 6 days. He worked by lantern light in the mornings and by fading daylight in the evenings. And he ate once a day and slept 5 hours. And on the last night he sat on the woodshed floor and could not stand up for a full 3 minutes. 5.2 cords total. Ring had been right about the arithmetic. A boy alone could not do it all. But Haver had one more thing Ring had not accounted for. He spent October 12th and 13th gathering hay. The sloughs east of the James River held stands of coarse grass that settlers called slough hay. Wild, dry, rough as rope. During the summer, it was nearly worthless as fodder and ignored as fuel. Alvar had read in a November issue of the Omaha paper, 3 months old when it reached the settlement, about Russian Mennonite settlers to the south who twisted slough hay into tight coils and burned them in their stoves when wood ran short. Slow burning, smoky, but hot enough to keep a stove alive through a cold night. He twisted hay all of October 13th until his hands were cut and his forearms burned from the friction. He stacked 300 pounds of hay coils inside the cabin itself against the east wall where the heat from the stove would keep them dry. 5.2 cords of cottonwood in the woodshed, 300 pounds of hay twists inside, a tunnel to reach the wood, a hatch to reach the surface. It was not 15 cords. It was not even close to Ring's numbers, but it was something no one else had. He fell asleep on October 14th with the Kane book open in his lap. the lantern burning down, the temperature outside dropping through the 20s toward the teens. He did not yet know what was coming, but he had built everything he knew how to build. And he had done it alone, and now there was nothing left to do but wait. He was 13 years old. It was the last warm night for a very long time. October 15th arrived with thunder, not summer thunder, low and rolling and far away. This was a different sound. Sharp inside the clouds, the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise, and the air smelled like iron. And then the snow came. It came in a wall. 1 minute Haver could see the Strand cabin 200 yards northeast. The next minute he could see nothing but white. The wind hit the west side of the cabin like a body thrown against it. The stove banked for the evening breathed hard as the pressure changed. The windows went white. The sound was enormous. He climbed the ladder to the roof hatch, cracked it an inch, and looked out. Nothing. Just snow moving sideways with enough force to cut. He let the hatch fall shut. Outside, across the settlement, 11 families would be pulling on ropes to reach their barns, stacking wood by the stove, sealing their windows against the driving cold. This was what they had prepared for. This was the normal storm, the kind they knew. The kind Gunner Strand had survived 7 times. But Halvor had seen the muskrat houses. He had seen the geese go early. He had heard the Lakota woman's words. He sat in his cabin and listened to the wind and understood something the others did not yet know. This was not the storm. This was just the first one. The storm of October 15th raged for 36 hours. When it finally broke, Oliver pushed through his roof hatch into still cold air and blinked against a white world. 2 feet of snow lay flat across the valley floor. The drifts ran higher, 5, 6, 8 feet, against anything that broke the wind. Fences were buried to their top rails. The path between his cabin and Strand's 200 yards northeast had ceased to exist. He dropped back through the hatch and walked to the passage door inside the tunnel. It was dark and cold and silent. The wind had not reached it. The plank roof held a ceiling of packed snow. He could see the weight of it bowing slightly between frames, but the cottonwood post did not flex. He walked the full length from cabin to woodshed in a crouch, his lantern casting orange light on the walls of willow and snow, and arrived at the woodshed door dry and upright. The tunnel worked. He stood in the woodshed and counted his cords, 5 2/3, plus the hay twists inside. He stacked an arm load of split cotton wood and carried it back through the passage to the cabin, set it by the stove, did it again. He fed the stove. He boiled water. He ate. Outside, he could hear the settlement waking up. The thud of shovels against drifted doors, men cursing in Norwegian. Strand's voice carrying something about the rope, something about the ox. Normal sounds. Hard sounds, but manageable. By noon, every cabin had its door dug clear. Strand walked past Halvor's claim that afternoon without stopping. He saw the roof hatch. He saw the line of the buried tunnel framework. A low ridge in the snow leading from the cabin to the woodshed. He kept walking. He said nothing. Halvor watched him go and understood the message. One storm. Doors cleared by midday. There was nothing to remark on, nothing to reconsider. The settlement had prepared as it always had, and the settlement had survived exactly as Strand predicted. Alvar went back inside and twisted more hay. November arrived slowly and then all at once. A week of warmth, true warmth, near 50 degrees, with mud in the yard and water running in the wheel ruts, made some of the settlers talk about an early thaw, a mild winter after all. Strand's preparation vindicated, and the boys' tunnel nonsense forgotten. Falk extended credit through the end of the month. The rain children played outside without coats. Halvor did not trust it. He spent the warm week cutting. His hands were cracked at the knuckles and bleed a little every morning until they warmed up. He added a half cord to the woodshed, stacked tight. He twisted more hay. He checked the tunnel. Frames for soft joints and retightened to that had shifted in the freeze-thaw cycle of October's aftermath. On November 12th, the second blizzard came. No thunder this time, just a drop in the barometer. The air going thin and gray in the space of an hour, and then white. 3 days of white. When it cleared, the snow was 4 feet on the level. and the drifts had buried Ring's fence posts entirely. Only the wire showed a thin dark line across the white the settlers dug out. They were slower this time, more tired. On November 21st, the third blizzard came. This one lasted 5 days, when the sky finally cleared on the 26th, a full week before. December, the snow outside Halvor's cabin door was 6 feet deep. He did not bother trying the door. He climbed his ladder, lifted the hatch, and pulled himself onto the surface. The settlement looked different now. Not buried, not yet, but transformed. The low-sod cabins had shrunk. Their roofline sat only 2 or 3 feet above the surrounding snow. The outbuildings had nearly vanished. The Anderson family's chicken coop, a small frame structure 20 yards from their cabin, was entirely gone beneath the white nothing visible but a shallow rectangular rise. Strand spent 2 days digging a trench from his cabin door to his woodshed. He and his oldest son worked in relay, one man digging while the other hauled. On the evening of November 28th, Halvor saw Strand walking the trench, testing the depth. It was 3 feet wide, for tea. Deep, open the sky, one storm would fill it. Halvor watched from his roof and said nothing. December came, the storms came with it. Blizzard on December 3rd, blizzard on December 9th. The temperature between storms did not climb above 0. The snow did not compact and settle. It stayed loose, crystalline, light as smoke in the wind, piling where the wind put it and staying there. Strand's open trench filled on December 3rd, and he did not have the strength to dig it again. He started bringing wood inside to arm loads at a time, 2 trips a day, running the rope line hand over hand in the white. It was dangerous work. 3 minutes in open air at -15 was enough to start frostbite. On exposed skin, one wrong step off the rope, in 0 visibility, and a man could wander 10 feet from his own door and never find it. The settlement went quiet. People stopped visiting. Each family sealed itself inside and rationed. Halvor walked his tunnel to the woodshed every morning and brought in what he needed. He was warm. His stove burned hot. He ate twice a day, cornmeal in the morning, rabbit stew at night. The rabbit snared in the willows by the river on the brief clear days between storms. He was alone. He had been alone since June. He was used to it. But he was watching the settlement smoke. Each morning he climbed through the roof hatch and stood on the snow and looked at 11 chimneys. Some burned thick and steady. Some burned thin. Fox chimney, which had gone heavy in November. The man burning trade goods, Halvor suspected, had thinned to almost nothing by mid-December. The Bjørnet cabin, which housed a widow and her 3 children, put out almost no smoke in the mornings. They were rationing hard, keeping the fire at minimum. He thought about this. He thought about it for 3 weeks, standing on his buried roof. Each morning in the cold, watching the smoke, he owed them nothing. Strand had dismissed him. Falk had tried to strip him of his claim. The community had left him to survive alone. Every cord in his woodshed, every frame in his tunnel, every hay twist by the east wall. He had built that himself in 30 days with raw hands and no help, except an anonymous roll of willow fencing that no one would admit to leaving. He thought about the 9 children in those cabins. He thought about the widow Bernted's 3. He went back inside and counted his cords. He had enough. He would not have enough if he shared it, but he had enough to keep the worst from happening. He was still working out exactly how to do it when February arrived, and took the choice away from him entirely. The great blizzard of February 2nd came out of the northwest with thunder inside it. Halvor had seen thunder snow before in October and November. He had never seen anything like this. The lightning was continuous, flash after flash, lighting the wall of cloud that swallowed the horizon in the space of 10 minutes. The temperature, which had been -12 at mid-morning, dropped to -28 before noon. The wind hit 60 miles per hour and held. There he had one warning. 20 minutes of sudden stillness in which the air went absolutely cold and clear and electric. And he used it. He went through the hatch and walked the surface to every chimney he could reach in 20 minutes, shouting down, each one, storm coming. Bank your stove, get your fuel inside now, stay inside no matter what. 3 chimneys, relistings. The Anderson families, the widow Björnids. He did not have time for the others before the wind returned and drove him back underground. He dropped through his hatch and pulled it shut and sat at the base of the ladder and listened. What he heard was not wind, it was pressure. The whole cabin breathed in and out as the gusts hit the walls. The stovepipe rang. The saw overhead. 18 and a packed earth flexed and dripped grit onto the floor as the temperature differential between inside and out reached 30, 40, 50. He banked the stove. He piled the hay twist close. He put on every piece of clothing he owned. 2 pairs of wool socks, 2 shirts, his father's heavy coat, and sat on the bench with the cane book in his lap and the lantern burning low and waited. For 9 days, the blizzard did not stop. He knew this only later, from comparing notes with others. Inside the cabin, there was no day and no night, just the lantern in the darkness, the stove in the cold, sleep and waking with no light to measure. Time by. He burned through 2 cords in those 9 days, keeping the fire constant, the cabin above freezing. He ate what he had. He slept in his coat. He did not go above the hatch. On what he thought was the 4th day, a sound came through the south wall, faint at first, then louder, rhythmic, knocking. He pressed his ear to the sod. Someone was on the other side of his wall, beating on it with something. He could not hear a voice through the wind, but he could feel the impact. Dull, steady, fist or boot. He climbed the ladder and opened the hatch section. The cold hit him like a wall. The wind was a physical thing. He could not see 3 feet in any direction. He screamed into the white. Who's there? Nothing came back, just whined. He dropped the hatch and stood at the bottom of the ladder for a long moment. Then he went to the tunnel door, pushed it open, and walked through to the woodshed. He came out through the woodshed's east-facing door into the teeth of the blizzard, sheltered slightly by the building's south wall, and found Ingrid Strand, Gunnar's wife, pressed flat against the cabin's exterior. One arm hooked around the stovepipe collar above her head as an anchor. She had a rope tied at her waist. The rope disappeared into the white. She had no fuel left. She had walked the rope line from the Strand cabin in -30 wind and 0 visibility. Until she hit something solid, she had been knocking for 10 minutes. Her hands were gray at the fingertips. Halvor got her inside. He sat her by the stove and put her hands in his and rubbed them until the gray went pink. And she gasped with the pain of it. He gave her water. He gave her cornmeal. She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "Gunnar is burning the table." He gave her 4 pieces of split cotton, wood, and a bundle of hay twists. He loaded his sled, a crude thing, 2 boards, and 2 runners with 10 more pieces of cottonwood and tied a rope to the front. He made her hold the rope and the sled and go back the way she came, hand over hand on her guide rope. He watched until the white swallowed her. He had 7 days of fuel left. He had just given away 2. He went back through the tunnel, through the cabin, up the ladder, and out the hatch. The world above was a flat white void. No depth. No shadow. The sun somewhere gave the air a faint gray light, just enough to see that the landscape had changed entirely where the settlement had stood. The cabins, the fences, the woodsheds, the barns. There was nothing. The snow ran level to the horizon, broken only by the thin, dark lines of chimney pipes protruding from the surface like fence posts. Some were smoking, some were not. The ones that were not smoking scared him. He marked the smoking ones in his mind. The nearest was 30 yards northeast. The Anderson family's pipe, a thin thread of gray. He walked toward it. The snow was crusted enough to hold his weight if he moved carefully. He had snowshoes, crude things, willow frames laced with strips of oxhide, and he put them on before climbing through the hatch. And they were the difference between standing and sinking. He reached the Anderson chimney and scraped snow away from the base until he found the pipe collar, the iron fitting where the stovepipe exited the roof. He disconnected the upper section with his heavy gloves and shouted down into the dark. "Halvor Eriksson," he said, "I have wood." A long silence. Then Marja Anderson's voice close and hoarse arrow. "Thank God." He lowered 4 pieces of cottonwood down the stovepipe hole on a rope. They were not split fine enough to go easily, and he had to work them one at a time. and his bare fingers on the rope at -28 were a problem he did not think about until afterward. He reconnected the pipe and moved on. The burned widow's chimney was cold. He dug down through the surface snow until he found the hatch, the one he had told the widow to cut in October, the one she had cut reluctantly 3 weeks after the meeting. After watching the 2nd November blizzard fill Strand's open trench in 48 hours, he pulled the hatch open from outside. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. Not frozen, not yet. Perhaps 30, the stove held dead ash. He dropped inside and found them in the bed. The widow Sigrid and her 3 children, all 4 of them under every blanket and quilt in the house. The children pushed tight to the center for warmth. The smallest, a girl of 4, was unconscious, not dead. He could feel her breath, but cold enough that waking her took 2 minutes of rubbing and calling her name. He built the fire himself. He split kindling from the pieces he had brought. He fed the stove slowly, the way his father had taught him. Too much, too fast. And you crack the firebox to little, and it never catches. He watched the temperature rise from 30 to 40 to 50. He watched Secret Bernard watch him with an expression he had no name for. When the cabin was warm enough, he went back through the hatch. He had 5 days of fuel left. He had given away 3 more pieces and used another starting Bjornid's fire. He did the math on the snow surface, standing in the white silence with the chimneys around him, 9 cabins remaining, his own fuel running short, the storm still blowing, no sign of a break. The burnt children still at risk if he couldn't resupply them within 24 hours. He went home, through the hatch and through the tunnel to the woodshed and stood in the dark with the lantern and looked at what he had left. 4.5 cords, 8 days at his own burn rate, less if he was supplying others. He thought about Strand still burning the table. He loaded the sled. It took 4 days to reach every cabin. He worked in 3-hour shifts out through the hatch. At first light, snowshoes on, sled loaded, moving from chimney to chimney in a grid pattern he had planned the night before. 3 hours outside was his limit in that cold. His hands lost feeling at the 2-hour mark, and lost feeling meant no dexterity. And no dexterity in the middle of a blizzard 300 yards from shelter meant death. 3 hours out, then back through the hatch, hands on the stovepipe until sensation returned. Eat something, sleep 1 hour, go again, the reeling family he reached. On the first day, Rilling opened his hatch from inside before Halvor even knocked. He had been watching for someone, some sign of life. His face when he saw Halvor there in the white silence carrying a sled of firewood was not an expression Halvor would describe to anyone. He took the wood without a word and passed down a half-pound of salt pork through the hatch. And Halvor took it because they both understood that charity required a transaction. The Strand cabin he saved for last. He reached it on the 4th day. The chimney had started smoking again, and Greed's delivery had kept them alive. But the smoke was thin. He scraped snow from the hatch he had told Strand to cut in September. The one Strand had refused to cut, there was no hatch. He dug down to the door instead. 4 feet of packed snow, working with the flat spade for 40 minutes in -25 air. He got the door open a foot. He pushed 6 pieces of cottonwood through the gap. He heard Strand's voice on the other side, low and unreadable. Halvor. Strand said, yeah. Halvor said, a long pause. Come inside. I have more deliveries. Halvor said he didn't. He had finished. But he pushed the door shut and began filling the trench back in with snow. And he did not look at the door as he worked. He was not ready for what Strand would say. He needed more time before he heard it. He went home through the surface. The storm broke on approximately February 11th. Halvor knew it by the silence. The wind stopped between one breath and the next, and the absence of it was so complete that he woke from sleep, certain something was wrong. He climbed the ladder and opened the hatch and looked out into still, cold, brilliant morning. The sky was clear. The temperature was -25. The sun hit the snow surface and threw back a light that was nearly impossible to look at. He stood on the buried roof of his father's soddy and looked at the world. The 11 chimney pipes stood in the white like markers. Every single one was smoking. He counted them twice. 11, all 11. He sat down on the snow and put his face in his hands and stayed there for a while. Strand called the meeting on February 14th when the surface trenches were solid enough to move between cabins without snowshoes. They met in the ring. Cabin, the only structure with ceiling height enough to stand, and they were all there. All 11 families bundled in coats, faces drawn from 4 months of cold and rationing and fear. Halver sat in the corner. He was the youngest person in the room by 15 years. Strand stood at the front. He was a big man, always had been, but the winter had taken something off him. His coat hung differently. His face was cut by a new set of lines that had not been there in September. He stood with his hands on the table for a moment before speaking, not looking at anyone. I have lived on this prairie for 7 years, Strand said. I have seen storms that killed oxen standing up. I have never been wrong about a winter. He raised his head. I was wrong about this one. The boy was right. I owe him my family's lives. And I am not a man who forgets a debt. The room was quiet. Relling spoke next. He had been working something out since October. Halver could tell. The way a careful man works out a calculation, he keeps getting wrong. He had the look of someone who had finally found the error in his own arithmetic. I said a boy couldn't cut 15 cords alone. Relling said, I was right. He cut 8. I said the tunnel was impossible for one person. I was wrong. He built the frame in 12 days and let the snow do the digging. I was thinking about the problem with a man's assumptions. He looked at Halver. He was thinking about it with a reader's imagination. The arithmetic was mine. The engineering was his. Fox said nothing. For a long time, he had lost most of his trade inventory to the stove. His bid on the Erickson quarter section was gone with it. You could not take a dead man's claim from the boy, who had just kept every family in the valley alive. When he finally spoke, he kept his eyes on the table. I don't apologize, Fox said. I said what any reasonable man would say. A 13-year-old boy on a dead man's claim talking about Eskimo tunnels. He shook his head slowly. Would you have believed him? I wouldn't do it differently. But I'll say this. He looked up. I was wrong about what the boy was capable of. It was not forgiveness. It was not warmth. But it was the truth. And from Fox, that was as much as anyone could ask. Strand's voice filled the room again. We will cut his claim clear. Before we cut our own, every man, no one argued by the end of February. Every cabin in the settlement had a roof hatch. Strand's son cut his father's hatch the same week as the meeting, working with the flat spade in methodical silence, the way his father did everything. Relling built his with squared lumber and iron hinges, the only iron hinges in the settlement, and it closed so cleanly that from outside you could not find the seam. The Anderson family's oldest daughter, who was 11, cut her family's hatch herself, working 3 evenings after supper until the framing was solid. Halver showed each family how to frame the opening, how to set the leather seal, how to rig the rope pull. He showed them without being asked. He charged nothing. He had one more cord in the woodshed. He split it fine and gave it to the Burntod widow in March when her supply ran short again. She tried to pay him with a smoked hunch of venison. Her last, he took half of it and left the rest. He was not ready to be owed favors. Not yet. But he was learning how they worked. The snow did not meaningfully recede until late April. On the 23rd, water began running in the Will Ruts for the first time since October. On the 30th, the James River came back into view, swollen and brown fast, running over its banks into the lowlands. Spring brought its own violence. The Missouri flooded catastrophically to the south. Yankton underwater, Vermilion nearly swept from its foundations. The full toll of the winter emerged as the territory thawed. Thousands of cattle dead on the open range. Dozens of homesteads abandoned. Families who had spent everything on a claim and lost it to the cold, limping back east with nothing. The hard winter would end the first wave of Dakota settlement. It would take years before the land filled again. The settlement along the James River lost no one. No deaths, no amputations, 3 cases of frostbite. To minor, 1 serious, Fox. Right hand that healed before the thaw was complete. within 2 years. The practice of cutting roof hatches that spread to settlements across Kingsbury and Beadle counties. Traveling settlers carried the idea the way they carried seeds and tool patterns, by description, by demonstration, by the simple observation that the people who had them had survived, and the people who hadn't had suffered. No one called it anything in particular. It was just a thing you did now. The way you roped to the barn and banked saw it against the walls. Haver Eriksson proved his father's claim and filed it in his own name. In the spring of 1888, the year he turned 21, he farmed the James River quarter section for the rest of his life. He married in 1892. He never moved. He lived until 1931, long enough to see electricity reach the valley, long enough to watch the Great Drought begin the work the blizzard had not finished. The sod cabin had been replaced by a frame house before. He was 25, but he kept the woodshed. He kept the woodshed long after there was any need for it. Long after coal and kerosene and eventually gas had replaced cottonwood in the stove. Neighbors thought it was sentiment. Maybe it was. On the morning of February 12, 1881, with the temperature at -25 and the great blizzard of February 2nd finally spent, a 13-year-old boy climbed through a hatch in his buried roof and stood on the snow surface and counted chimneys. Gunner Strand, who had survived 7 Dakota winters and buried to oxen in the storm of 73, had told the settlement plainly in September, "Prepare as we always have. 5 cords roped to the barn. Seal the windows. That was how you lived through winter in Dakota territory, not by cutting holes in your roofs like fools. 11 chimneys, everyone smoking." The boy who had cut holes in his roof counted them once more to be sure. Then he went back through the hatch and down the ladder and into the tunnel, and out to the woodshed and loaded his sled one more time because, for cabins still had thin smoke, and thin smoke meant low fires, and low fires meant cold children, and there was still wood to carry. He had no money, he had no family. He had 45 neighbors who had called him a liar and left him alone to build or die. He loaded the sled anyway. He had learned something that winter that Strand and Ring and Falk had not yet learned. Something that would take them months of warm weather and clear minds to work out. That knowing what a storm looks like is not the same thing as knowing what the worst storm looks like. That experience, enough of it, can become its own kind of blindness. Haver Eriksson was 13 years old. He had no experience to blind him. He pulled the rope over his shoulder and went out through the hatch into the cold white morning, alone and moving, and somewhere below him, in 11 buried cabins across 2 square miles of Dakota territory, 45 people were alive.